Hello Americans channel. This video is made by free videos from Storyblocks, and these images and video we use just for explanation and it's free use also.
The life of a local woman got flipped upside down when she unexpectedly inherited the weirdest thing. She apparently was written down in her neighbor's will, and, as a result, was gifted this warning down the cabin. The woman, for the life of her, could not imagine why it was hers to receive. But then, she stepped inside and was stunned by what she found. Neighbor inherits cabin from old lady, then she finds this inside. This bizarre adventure started in a notary office where Susan was unexpectedly invited. She had received a letter stating that her neighbor had a special gift waiting for her. The only thing she had to do was to accept the old lady's will to receive it. Suzanne was flattered, but also a bit confused. Why was she the one who received something? She isn't family. She sat across the notary, a slender man in a neat blue suit, and explained that she and her neighbor Margaret were always close. Suzanne went by for coffee moments a couple of times a week, and after Margaret passed away 2 weeks ago, Suzanne could honestly say that she missed her 92-year-old friend a lot. But to be included in someone's will was a different story. The notary employee assigned to Margaret's will, however, ensured Susan that this was not a mistake. He was there when the old lady embedded Suzanne in her will. It wasn't that long ago, even, and I remember it vividly because what you're inheriting is quite unusual, the man said. The notary pulled out a yellow envelope and showed Susan a picture of a worn-down building. Your neighbor has left you her old cabin in the woods. The notary employee admitted that it sounded weird when said out loud, but he emphasized that this was far from a joke. The man pushed the pictures toward Susan and pointed at the old woodland structure. After that, he pulled out a brass key for the envelope to complete the presentation. Suzanne raised an eyebrow, still slightly shocked about everything that had just occurred. A cabin. I never knew that Margaret owned such a building, and we often talked. And why would she leave it to me? What am I to do with it? The notary simply shrugged, stating that that part was up to Susan. But Margaret did tell me that the cabin was very special to her, he said. The notary ended his conversation by saying that Margaret refused to tell him why the building was special. But she insisted that Suzanne had to be the one to get it. He placed the key back in the yellow folder and asked Susan to sign on the dotted line to complete the transaction. Suzanne did, and with this signature, she unknowingly signed the start of a crazy journey. Suzanne Googled the cabin's coordinates and saw that it was about an hour's drive from the notary's office. It was located deep in a woodland area, with no other civilization around it for miles. Suzanne's curiosity was understandably piqued, and even the notary looked intrigued. I suggest you go there now and see what you got, were his parting words. With the key and directions to the cabin on her passenger seat, Suzanne set out toward the cabin. She was compelled to find out what all this fuzz was about. More importantly, she wanted to figure out why Margaret would leave the building in her name. The answers to all these questions would indeed soon be answered, but unfortunately, not all of them would be pleasant. Suzanne's car drive quickly steered her away from the buzzing surroundings of the city. Buildings faded in the background, and green fields with dense woodland patches took their place. While the trees passed her car, Suzanne imagined what she would find inside the wooden home. Maybe the old lady grew up there, and childhood trinkets would fill the rooms behind its walls. Or maybe it used to be an old fishing lodge, which was her pastime hobby. Whatever it was, Suzanne was getting increasingly excited to find out. But the young woman later admitted that she could never have imagined what she found inside. The last 2 miles were not reachable by car. Susan parked her vehicle in a sandy ditch and chose to walk the final stage. The terrain was rugged, but after about 30 minutes of walking, Susan saw the cabin for the first time. The structure had definitely seen better days. Its wood was rotten in some places, and most windows were already gone. Suzanne wondered what she even had the key for, but in the spirit of formality, she used it anyway to open the main door. The cabin door opened with a loud and hollow screech, revealing the inside. The place felt eerie, and Susan shivered as she stepped over the threshold. "What mystery do you have in store for me, Margaret?" Suzanne said while squinting her eyes. Light entered through the open window holes, revealing tons of dust particles in the air. It was clear that nobody had been in here for a long time. The cabin was dusty, filled with old trinkets and worn furniture covered in cobwebs. Susan walked past all of them and even picked some items up from their settled position. One of the trinkets was a portrait of Margaret, with what appeared to be some relatives because they looked like her. Margaret held 2 giant balloons spelling 65, indicating it was her birthday. This place was bizarre. It was clearly owned by Margaret, but given its state, it was also clear that it had not been used in ages. It was a house, frozen in time, untouched, and unloved. But why was it important now? Why did the old lady insist that Susan had to have it? At least, that was what the notary conveyed to her. Suzanne wandered through the small rooms of the cabin, trying to understand what made this place so special. But no matter how many times she walked past the rooms, they did not talk back to her. Suzanne was left with no answers. But that was about to change out of nowhere. The confused woman decided to make one last pass through the cabin before calling it a day. Her pace quickened, lowering the arc in her step. As she paced the floor, Suzanne's foot suddenly got caught on something sticking up from the wooden floor. The young woman lost her balance and stumbled over, falling on the creaking floor hard. Ow. What the hell was that? Suzanne yelled out as she looked behind her. The floor was the same all over except for one spot. Right in the center of the main room was a small piece of carpet, approximately 3 feet by 3 feet. It was one of those Persian rugs you see in musky thrift stores, and when Susan fell over it, she also moved it to the right a bit, revealing an uneven piece of floorboard underneath. And then she saw it. The uneven part that just tripped over Susan wasn't just any piece of rotten wood. It was the edge of a hatch. The thing barely reached above floor level, and with the rug covering the whole thing, it was pretty much invisible to unwanted intruders. But with the piece of fabric now out of the way, it was hard to ignore. Suzanne crawled to the hatch on all fours. The confused woman's heart raced as she sat beside the mysterious hatch. She reached out with both hands and latched her fingers around the metal handle in the center of it. What was beneath this thing? It must be there for a reason. There was only one way to find out, to open it. So, with all her might, Susan pulled upwards to remove this new obstacle. The wooden cover flipped over, landing on the floor with a loud bang. Susan looked inside the gaping hole it left behind and saw nothing but pitch. Black darkness at first, but then she noticed a wooden ladder attached to the side. It was a scary descent, but Suzanne's curiosity won over her frightened state. She placed a first foot on the ladder and then a second one. Suzanne was now surrounded by darkness, but with a little bit of hesitation, she reached the bottom of the stairs. The air down there was much colder and muskier than the ground floor, which added to its eeriness. To remedy that situation, Susan felt around, trying to find a source of light. Luckily for her, within a couple of minutes, she did. A light switch was flicked, and the entire basement level lit up. The area was more significant than Susan anticipated, at least twice the size of the ground floor. It also sported much more furniture than the rest of the house, indicating that most of the living was done down here. This was odd, but the reason would eventually become much clearer. Susan walked through the basement slowly, inspecting everything. Shelves lined the walls, stacked with books and strange objects, figurines, and even what looked like animals in strong water. Well, this is unsettling. Suzanne whispered as she walked past the canisters. A dusty, old-fashioned desk stood in the corner, covered in yellowed papers. Curiously but nervously, Suzanne walked toward it. She stood behind the desk and glanced at the paperwork. Suzanne noticed they were maps depicting specific locations that did not make sense initially. But when she placed each map side by side, she realized it was the city where she and Margaret lived. What did these maps mean? The maps were marked in multiple areas with a red pen, as if Margaret had researched this area for years. But why? These scribbles did not make any sense yet. But that was all about to change. Suzanne lifted up the biggest piece of map fragment and then noticed that there were multiple photographs lying underneath. Some were in black and white, and others had a splash of faded color on them. Suzanne dropped her head down to inspect what was on there. The pictures were all of woodland, like areas, and in each image, people were posing. Suzanne did not recognize any of the individuals. They all seemed to be different every time, except for one. In every photo, the same person was positioned right in the center. A young woman. Susan estimated that she was somewhere in her mid-30s. Was this Margaret in her younger years? Suzanne inspected the woman in the pictures thoroughly. And then she saw it. It was the way the central figure looked into the camera, the way she tensed her shoulders. There was no denying it. This woman was her neighbor, Margaret. Margaret wore a jumpsuit and was holding finer digging gear in all of the images, and when Susan flipped on over, it said, "Digging site October 2nd, 1968. It was clear that Margaret was some sort of archaeologist before she retired and met Suzanne. Was this her research cabin? Suzanne looked around and found multiple excavation tools lying around, validating this theory. This also explained the animal parts in strong water a bit, but the puzzle was far from being complete because the biggest question remained. Why did she leave me this place? As a final moment of discovery, Suzanne opened the lowest drawer on the desk and found a thick yellow envelope. It had no label on top, but inside she found a picture and a letter with Susan's name on it. The confused woman jumped back out of initial fright, but then started reading the contents of this letter. And what she found would change her life. The letter said the following: "Dear Suzanne, you may find all of these discoveries quite strange and have no idea why I brought you here, but I assure you that leaving my cabin to you was no mistake. I wanted you to find my basement and also to take my notes because there is something very important I want you to do." The letter told Suzanne to take the maps with their markings plus everything inside this envelope and give it to the authorities in the nearest county. My findings must be published and acted upon. It's justice. I would have done it myself, but I never found enough proof in my youthful years, and when I finally did, I was old and dying. Finish my work. Put a stop to this. The letter ended with one important repeating message. Don't bring it to the police in our own county. They cannot be trusted. Once you've brought my information to the right people, everything will explain itself. Suzanne was completely confused, but obliged to the orders in the letter. After some climbing and covering the basement hatch, Suzanne stood outside with even more questions than when she entered. Suzanne placed the contents on her driver's seat and drove the car toward the police station, one county over, just like Margaret asked of her. She was unsure of why she was doing this, but she trusted that her neighbor, whom she always cared for, was not trying to put her in harm's way, even though the secrecy of all of this felt a bit shady to Suzanne. Suzanne arrived at the neighboring county's police station, gripping the mysterious envelope tightly in her hand. A stern-looking officer at the front desk directed her to a detective who dealt with these kinds of things. She hoped they would take her seriously, despite the strange nature of her story. As she sat waiting, she wondered just how much Margaret had hidden in her life. Finally, a man named Detective Harris called her into his office. Suzanne took a deep breath and explained her story: Margaret's will, the basement, the strange maps, and the plea to bring the evidence to a specific authority. Harris listened intently and never interrupted Susan as she pleaded her case. His eyes narrowed as Susan described the instructions in the letter. Harris leafed through the papers and pictures she'd handed over, lingering over each item. Suzanne, you may not have known this, but Margaret wasn't just an archaeologist. She was much more than that. Susan's neighbor, the sweet old lady who made her biscuits every Sunday, was involved in an underground investigation into several missing artifacts from digging sites around this region. Suzanne's eyes widened. Margaret's quiet life had never hinted at anything like this. But why keep it a secret? She asked, confusion creeping back. Harris paused, studying her. Margaret was working with a small team in my county, he explained. They suspected certain local authorities were involved in hiding this criminal digging operation and selling the dug-up artifacts on the black market for profit. The officer told Suzanne that her county was the only area in North America where the ancient Mayan people settled. It was just a tiny speckle of land, large enough for one town, but when the Mayans left, they also left tons of riches behind, ready to be dug up. These artifacts were meant for museums and archives, and your neighbor was part of the excavation team, but that never happened, unfortunately. The team that oversaw the excavation worked for your county on paper, but secretly had ties to multiple shady organizations. They weren't interested in preservation, only in making money. So, most of the artifacts found were confiscated. Your neighbor got wind of it and started working with us to gather proof. But she never managed to act on it in her lifetime, unfortunately. The detective stated that they now had more than enough evidence. Margaret apparently worked tirelessly on this in secret, staying hidden away in her cabin. She must have trusted you to carry out her work. Suzanne felt a chill run through her. This was bigger than she'd imagined. Margaret had been investigating influential people in the county for decades. The letter's warning made sense now. So, what do we do now? Susan asked, nerves prickling. Harris looked at Susan and pointed toward the map. He explained that the red markings indicated the digging sites that had not been found yet. Well, apparently, Margaret knew about them but had not told anyone about them, hoping these artifacts would remain hidden. Then the officer pointed out the pictures. They first went to the dig site with a team of trusted archaeologists. They needed proof that the items were still there, just like Margaret said they would. And sure enough, when they dug, the team uncovered what seemed to be an ancient artifact hidden deep in the soil. The team was ecstatic, and Detective Harris saw this as enough proof to reopen this mass investigation. Now, it was time to make some arrests, and with Margaret's detailed notes and photographic proof, it wasn't hard to find everyone involved. The police obtained search warrants, which quickly resulted in the arrests of multiple people within the criminal organizations. But not just that. The chief of police and several government officials were also detained. One person even had a ceremonial mask hanging on his living room wall. The investigation quickly uncovered hidden stashes of rare artifacts in surprising places, including private estates owned by individuals Margaret had mapped out in her research. As the case unraveled, the county's corruption was exposed. A network of local officials had been working to hide and profit from the sale of artifacts. Margaret's meticulously gathered evidence now allowed the team to uncover years' worth of secret dealings. Suzanne, stunned by the revelations, felt a bittersweet pride in her late neighbor's work. Margaret had risked so much for this cause, hoping someone would finish what she had started. Suzanne realized that her connection to Margaret had given her a vital role in seeing justice done. Her neighbor was small and innocent, looking in stature, but on the inside she was a true badass. Weeks passed, and the media caught wind of the operation, allowing Suzanne to follow the entire journey on TV. She saw how police authorities in Suzanne's county faced justice, Some were fined or even arrested, just like multiple high-ranking officials who looked the other way. Suzanne was amazed that her find caused all of this, but she knew that this was what Margaret wanted. Harris told Suzanne that she had done more than just deliver a letter. She had helped expose a network of crime. Your friend Margaret was a brilliant, courageous woman, he said, and because of her, and you, a piece of history has been saved. They will be brought to museums and archives to be preserved for generations, and nobody will profit illegally from them ever again. As she returned to her normal life, Suzanne kept the old key from Margaret's cabin. It was a reminder of her late friend's bravery and the bizarre adventure it took her on. "Margaret, you were such a badass," Susan said, smiling as she visualized her old neighbor doing research in her cabin. She definitely saw the 92-year-old woman in a different light now. Suzanne visited Margaret's cabin one last time after that, but instead of research, the air was now filled with a sense of peace. She cleared away some dust and cobwebs, honoring the woman who'd left such a profound legacy behind. As she walked out, she couldn't help but feel that Margaret's spirit lived on, both in her heart and in the justice she had brought to light.